This week, we're going to focus on more discrimination during the Industrial Revolution. We're really going to pinpoint the discrimination that happened against African Americans. There were a couple different ways that they were discriminated against. The South passed laws that were discriminatory against former slaves. One of these ways was literacy tests. Of course, literacy means to read or write. Voters were supposed to be able to read selections from the Constitution. Well, only African American voters were actually made to take these tests. This was first used in Mississippi in 1890 to discriminate against African Americans. This was a huge problem for African Americans because many former slaves couldn't read or write well, if even at all. So they definitely would not be able to pass the literacy test and have a say in who they were voting for. The next way was an actual poll tax. A poll is when you go to somewhere and vote in an election. A poll tax was collected before the harvest. So that created a problem for poor farmers. They had extreme difficulty paying this poll tax. Since the average cost was between $1 and $1.50, it was very expensive, and you had to pay back taxes for the years you couldn't have voted. You could have voted and you didn't. There was something created called the grandfather clause. Now, on the outside, it looks very good, but when you start really pinpointing the different specifics for this clause, here comes the problem. The grandfather clause said that if your grandfather could vote before 1870, then you could vote now as well. This was okay for poor white farmers, but the problem was that most African American men wouldn't have been able to vote because their grandfathers couldn't have voted before 1870 because before then the 15th Amendment wasn't passed. There were many protests. African Americans protested their exclusion from public life. However, violence and intimidation by discriminatory groups silenced most of these protests. In the North, there were not discriminatory laws for voting in the North, but there was still discrimination. The first way is that African Americans lived in segregated neighborhoods. They were often the last hired on a job and the first fired. Although they were able to vote, they had little political power because of their relatively small numbers until the Great Migration.